Welcome back. Let's continue on with the Deborah story. Let's do a little refresh here. So we started off, Deborah's down here. She goes and anoints Barak up in Kadesh to fight this battle because he's supposed to be that military leader. And when it comes down to it, Barak really isn't much of a military leader because he's relying on the help of a woman, which is supposed to be insulting in the scripture. But he comes out and they have this big battle with the king of Hazor, Jabin, who's supposed to know and be perceptive about things, but seems to be clueless all along in the story. And they have this battle, and uh, Jabin ends up getting defeated. Well, his commander of his army ends up getting defeated and is retreating. And instead of Barak chasing him, he's chasing some chariots. He's kind of out of position, and they end up over here somewhere where just some housewife ends up killing the commander of the army of King Jabin and really giving Israel victory. And so we see in the Deborah story uh, sort of this triumph of women over men, but it's not meant to be a rah-rah moment for women saying that they're so great. Because remember, this is an ancient text, so we have to read it with ancient eyes. It's really meant to humiliate men and basically say men can't get it done. So who should be your king, Israel? Yahweh. Or who should you be counting on as being your king? Yahweh, because he's the one who's orchestrating all these things in the background. He's the one who can really get it done. So don't put your trust in these human kings, because even your military champion, Barak, can't get it done. And even these foreign kings who are supposed to have so much strength with 900 chariots and all these men and supposed to be so perceptive and wise are defeated by a housewife. So why would you want any other person to be king over you than Yahweh himself when all these other opportunities, all these other choices that you have don't get it done? So that's kind of the Deborah story up until this point. And Deborah, who's kind of known to be a judge in Israel because of the first part of the opening scripture here, really isn't the judge. She doesn't fit the prototype. She doesn't fit some of the markers that we're looking for when it comes to being a judge. She's just one who does judicial judging when it talks about it in the scripture. But she has this song. This is kind of the second part to the Deborah story, where she has this song, I guess you could call it that she sings here in the scripture. We're not really going to read all. We're just going to kind of handpick a few places in here to sort of talk about some things. But we'll start from the top. Then Deborah and Barak, they sang on that day, saying, when locks are long in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly, bless Yahweh. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. To Yahweh I will sing. I will make melody to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Yahweh went out. Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds indeed poured water. Why? Because he's the king. Yahweh is. The mountains quake before Yahweh, the one of Sinai, before Yahweh, the God of Israel. So they're basically singing this song praising God and talking about the victory that he gave them over King Jabin. But we're going to skip down a few verses and we're going to look at where Deborah calls out some of the tribes of Israel for not coming with and joining in the battle against King Jabin. So let's come down here. I believe it is verse 15. So verse 15 of chapter 5 of Judges. The chiefs of Issachar came with Deborah. Okay, great. So they joined. And Issachar, faithful to Barak. Into the valley they rushed out at his heels. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of heart. So right here we see Issachar join with them, right? It says the chiefs of Issachar came with Deborah, because it's Deborah and Barak together, they're going out to battle. However, among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart, as if they didn't come. Why did you tarry among the sheepfolds? To hear the piping of the flocks, right? She's talking about to the Reubenites. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan. Why did he abide with the ships? Asher sat still at the sea, at the coast of the sea, sitting down by his landings. Zebulun is a people that scorned death, Naphtali too on the heights of the field. So Zebulun and Naphtali joined in. But if we go to our map, let's sort of take this off and switch the thing real quick. I think we want division of Canaan, and we'll zoom out. So one of the things we're seeing here is Reuben didn't join, and Gilead is kind of part of Gad. So Reuben and Gad, they didn't come out and help. Neither did Dan, but Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali did. They were helpful, but these other tribes, they didn't come and join in the battle here at Mount Tabor. And so Deborah is calling them out. And so what we're seeing here is this shift from Israel being united to now they're starting to disintegrate. Because remember, the downward spiral, these themes keep getting more pronounced and more pronounced. Because at the beginning, when we read in the prologue, Israel was together. Simon and Judah went out and they fought their enemies and they were united and they were given victory. But then we start to see that there's this disunity creeping in, right? With Ehud, we saw that he rallied the people in the hill country of Ephraim and fought against Moab. But now, when there was a rally cry for Israel to come out and fight their enemies, Reuben, Gilead, Asher, and Dan weren't there. And so we see Deborah chastising these tribes because they didn't help. And so the disunity starts to play in to the scripture. At the beginning of Judges, Israel's unified. By the time we get to the end, they're literally going to be driving one another to extinction because the tribe of Benjamin is going to be nearly wiped out. So this is where this theme starts to pick up. That now some of these tribes are being called out because they didn't help. And notice these are tribes that did not drive out the inhabitants of the land that we read in the prologue. But this is where this theme of the tribal disunity comes in, and this is where the downward spiral intensifies. Remember, we're moving from Yahweh being king over Israel to then having a human king. And human kings cause division. They cause strife. And we're seeing this develop in Israel. Even though Yahweh's in the background orchestrating all these things and he is remaining sovereign through it all, we see Israel itself as a people-to-people relationship, as that political relationship. We see that starting to decline and they're starting to attack one another, just like the people of the promised land, right? The foreigners in the promised land, Canaanites, Perizzites, all those people are in conflict with one another. We now see Israel starting to become just like them and fighting amongst themselves. This is not a good way for them to go because it shows right in their actions that they really are rejecting Yahweh as king over Israel, because Yahweh unifies and brings together. But here we see some cracks in all of this starting to develop because their heart is not set after Yahweh, because they keep going down the downward spiral. They're not really repenting. They're just sacrificing and saying they're sorry, something we looked at earlier in the prologue. And so we see this starting to develop, and it's getting scary. So here we have the downward spiral. We started with Othniel, and we looked at Ehud, and we're looking at Deborah now, and Gideon's coming next. But each one of these judges, so to speak, or each one of these stories is like a spiral, and it has all those themes in it, and we see those themes repeating, but they're also connected together. One bridges the gap to the other. We see that with Othniel and Ehud and Deborah to Gideon. There's repeated themes and words that are used to link these stories together, so they're not just a collection of stories that are just placed in there to sort of make a point. It's all linked together because remember, we're reading theology here. It's not just history or chronology. This is theology. And so it is woven together to tell us something about God. And one of the things we're going to learn is Yahweh is king in Israel. No one else. But the people have rejected that. And so they're going through this downward spiral. And it started with, well, really didn't start with Othniel because he's the prototype. He gets it right. But from there, we see this decline. We see this disintegration of Israel's faith in Yahweh. And we're seeing it pick up pace. But remember, this is going somewhere. And by the time we get to Samson, we're going to see the people have just rejected Yahweh. Because at the very end, right, At the very, very end of Judges, we read that last line, the last verse, and it says that there was no king in Israel. So we sort of reached that bottom of the downward spiral of going from Yahweh as king to then no king. But there are some connections here in these different stories that I want to point out because I think it's helpful for us to understand how things are being weaved together and how things really are weaved together in our own lives, right? So Ehud, in the Ehud story, we hear that he rallied the people in the hill country of Ephraim, right? Ephraim. And we hear that Deborah is from Ephraim, right? She was in that area. So we see here the location, the geography tying the stories together. We also have this instance of Shamgar. Let's look at that real quick. That's 331. So if we go back up here to Judges 3:31, at the very end of the Ehud story, I don't think we even touched on this. It says here, after him, so after Ehud, came Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel. So here you notice it says he delivered, not he judged. So that sort of ties that idea of what a judge in Israel looks like, is that they deliver. Ehud delivered, Shamgar delivered, but when it comes to Deborah, it says that she judged. So that's how we know that she did it in a judicial sense, not necessarily in the same sense as the military victory. But here we have, he killed 600 Philistines. So this, again, reinforces that military paradigm of what a judge does. But we have Shamgar here mentioned in the Ehud story. And then if we come down here to chapter 5, verse 6, it says, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept to the byway. Right? So here Shamgar appears again, linking these stories together. So we see that there are these connections that link one story to the other because we're talking about a theological flow of mind and theological points being made. And so you're going to see similar themes and geography and people weave throughout because the writer of Judges wants you to see this as one piece. One of the interesting things that we also see as a theme repeated is this right here, the mistaken death of a foreign ruler. If you remember the Ehud story, King Eglon, the fatted calf was slaughtered, but his cohort, his people, his bodyguards thought that he was upstairs going to the bathroom. They didn't realize he was dead. They were mistaken, right? Well, we see the same thing happening in the Deborah story. Near the end, right? Because remember in the Ehud story, Eglon was the king and his people thought he was just taking or going to the bathroom instead of being dead. Well, here we have Sisera's mother asking why her son is so late in coming home, right? Because she assumed, like all the other people in the house of King Jabin, that Sisera would be victorious over these measly, pesky Israelites who don't have much of an army at all. And so what does she say? Verse 28, out of the window she peered. So this is Sisera's mother, or the mother of Sisera, right? Yes, it says she gazed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariot? So why isn't he here? And then her wisest ladies make answer. Indeed, she answers the question herself. Verse 30, are they not finding and dividing the spoil? Oh, I know why they're not here. My Sisera, because he has the battle, he won. We know he won. He's just dividing up the spoil, right? Verse 30, are they not finding and dividing the spoil? A girl or two for every man? Spoil of dyed stuffs for Sisera? Spoil of dyed stuffs embroidered? 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for my neck as spoil? So, right, what is she saying here? Oh, well, my boy's dividing up the spoil and he's giving the Israelite girls who they conquered to the men so that they could rape them as a way of as their prize of war. Different time back then. I'm not saying I endorse any of this stuff, but this is her mindset. But she's mistaken because we know Sisera died, and he not only died, right? He died at the hands of a woman. He died at the hands of a woman, and this is interesting. Verse 27. He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Sisera's mother was thinking that Sisera and his boys were going to be having sex with these women, right, as a prize of war. But what do we find? Sisera is lying dead at the feet of a woman, or you could say between her legs. There's where he fell and where he sank and where he died. Whereas the mother is thinking that Sisera will be enjoying himself between the legs of a woman, he is lying dead between the legs of a woman, lying still at her feet. And so we see here kind of this irony, because these people are so mistaken, because they're so sure of themselves, because they're so powerful with their 900 chariots and their strong army. But what happens? They're mistaken. And Yahweh gets the victory. And so we see this here in this song that they sing. And then it ends here. So perish all your enemies, O Yahweh. But may your friends be like sun at its rising in its might. And the land had rest 40 years. So we see that interesting thing come up. And we see these connections, right, between Ehud and Deborah. But we also see it with Gideon. In the Gideon story, prophets are mentioned. A prophet comes and gives him a word from God that God has chosen him. And what do we find in the Deborah story? Deborah, a prophetess, anoints or commissions Barak. So we have that connection. Also, Gideon is under a tree when he receives this, and the prophetess Deborah, she also is under a tree. So she's under the palm of Deborah between, I think, Ramah and Bethel or something like that. So those are connections that set up. And also the verb usages throughout the Ehud story, the Deborah story, and the Gideon story are there. When it says that Jael took the tent peg and drove it, those are the same verbs when it talks about Ehud thrusting the sword into Eglon's belly, and then also the same type of verb when it says Gideon blew the trumpet. So you have these same words connecting these stories together, and this just sort of helps us see that there's a theological theme running through these stories that we should not skip out on. And the main one is that Yahweh is king in Israel, and he's the one orchestrating these things, because these are all flawed people. Ehud is flawed, Gideon is flawed, the people in the Deborah story are flawed, but God works through those flaws, or in spite of those flaws, to show that he is the sovereign one. Show that he is the sovereign one. So let's look at a little bit of practical application here. So let's look at some of the scriptures that we read and ask ourselves this question. Who is ordering the events in the Deborah story? In 4:2, we read, Yahweh sold them into the hand of King Jabin. Let's go to that real quick. So chapter 4, verse 2. So Yahweh sold them, that's Israel, into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan. So why is Israel in the hand of King Jabin? Because Yahweh put them there. Okay? Verse 9. Is that right? Yeah. So verse 9. And she said, I will surely go with you. Never, because this is Deborah responding to Barak. The road on which you're going not lead your going, for Yahweh will sell Sisera. Who will? Yahweh will. Yahweh sold Israel into the hand of King Jabin. Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, verse 15. Yahweh threw Sisera and all his chariots into a panic before Barak. Who did? Yahweh did. And then when we come to the end of the Deborah story, what does it say? So on that day, God subdued King Jabin. It opened up with, where is it? God sold them into the hand of King Jabin. And then it ends with, God subdued King Jabin before the Israelites. Who's king in Israel? Yahweh. Who's the sovereign God of all the universe? Yahweh. Who's ordering the events in Deborah's story? Yahweh. Who is ordering the events in your life? Yahweh. Who's the real deliverer in all of this? We know it's not Deborah. We know it's not Barak or Jael, the housewife. It is Yahweh. A very big and bold statement is being made here in the Deborah story that Yahweh is the deliverer. He is the true judge. He is the true king of Israel. And this becomes important because the next story is Gideon. Gideon's the focal point. Gideon is where we see this dramatic shift from Israel being faithful to Yahweh to being faithless, where they switch from Yahweh as king to wanting a human king. But it's set up here in the mind of the reader, that's you and me, that we know who the real king is. It's Yahweh. So when we get to the Gideon story and we see that changes, that the people want a human king, we're supposed to be like, oh, you idiots, why are you doing this? Because we already know in very bold colors that it is Yahweh who does all of these things. But when it really comes down to it, who is the real deliverer in your life? Who's been orchestrating all of the things in your life? Has your life really been up to chance? Or up to the decisions you've made? I mean, God is sovereign. Don't ever forget that. He's the one orchestrating history and the things of your life as we see it in the scripture here in Deborah. God sold them into the hand of Jabin. God subdued King Jabin at the end. Yahweh's the one orchestrating these things. And Yahweh's the one orchestrating things in your life. Now, we live in New Testament times, so we can understand it better and more vividly in the life of Jesus. He's the one who is the real deliverer for us and the king of our lives, right? And in our church too, and in our world. And the real question that we are presented with, are we going to submit to the king of history, right? So Jesus. Or are we going to look for a human king? Because all of these things, right? Jesus is sovereign through it all. We get to choose whether or not we want to partner with Jesus and be his agent or merely be an instrument. Now, we've gone over being an agent and instrument before, but it bears repeating. An agent is one who partners with God right here, right now, and chooses to do things God's way and understand his ways and walk with him. Whereas an instrument is someone like Samson, right? Don't really have an idea of what's going on. God still uses you just like he did with King Jabin to make a point, but it's usually a lot more painful. You certainly want to be an agent rather than an instrument. But either way, especially we see it in the Deborah story, God's will is done. Whether we help to participate in it or not, he bends history towards his will, so to speak. And so we need to ask the question, who is the real deliverer in our life and in our church and in our world? We know the answer. The answer is Yahweh, it's Jesus. But the question really helps us to understand, how are we going to choose to live our life? Because if that answer really is true, then that changes how we live. But we don't really want to change how we live. We want to think that some things are beyond the control of God so that we can make our own choices. But I'm telling you, that's not how this works. You really believe that Jesus is the author of salvation, that he holds history in his hands, that he is sovereign over it all, then you have to live life his way. That's the only logical response, is really to give your life to him and to walk in his ways and do things his way, because there is no other besides him. He's the real deliverer. He's the true king. He's the true king. And so we're confronted with this. We see it personally in our own lives and in the well-being of our church and of our world. This is where things get really hard and sticky, because we like to have a cop-out, kind of like Barak. If you'll go with me, then I'll go. We like to have that concrete security in things that we want to trust more than God, but that's not how this works. God's will is done regardless of whether we choose to join him or be used by him, but it's much better to choose him and to partner with him in all of this. And the book of Judges is really given to us as a gift, right? It's given to us so that we don't have to live this out. Because here we have the consequences of what it looks like whenever we live our lives without God. or whenever we choose to not partner with him. And so we have an example here. Really, it's a good example of a bad example of what it looks like to reject God as king of your life. But we get it ahead of time so that we don't have to live it out. Because many people live this out in their lives, but you don't have to. We get it here in God's holy word. It's authoritative and it works in our lives, right? And we get to learn from it ahead of time so that we don't have to live it out. But the problem is, like what we find with Barak and many of the other flawed characters here in Judges, is that we don't take God at his word. It usually takes us living it out to get the point. But wise is the person who will take God at his word, especially through the Bible, right? And learn from it ahead of time and not have to live these things out. And Judges is given as a great example of that if you want to know how your life is going to look like without God being king in your life, read Judges. That's how it goes. So you can read it, know it, and choose not to live that. Choose a different path, which is definitely something I would suggest. So really what we're confronted with here is the choice that Gideon has to make. And this is the choice we're going to see him fail to make. And it's, will Yahweh be your king? Because with Gideon, he rejects Yahweh and he tries to set himself up as king. Now, he says in the scripture that, no, I'm not going to be your king, but all of his actions say otherwise. And we're going to see that actions speak louder than words. But it's this choice of Gideon, will Yahweh be your king? And this is the thing that we are confronted with, and that is presented throughout Judges. It shows us a life lived without Yahweh as king. And it's a downward spiral. It's full of cunning and brutality and treachery, and it's terrible. There's really no redemption in it. And that's what happens when people reject Yahweh as their king and choose not to live according to his ways. There's no grace there. And it's brutal and it's hard. But we don't have to live like that. We don't have to live like that. And that's the beautiful thing. We're given this example ahead of time. And if we just take God at his word, if we just take God at his word, we can choose to partner with him and not have a Judge's story of our life. We can have a different story. So that's what I would encourage you in. We're on the doorstep of Gideon, and we have a choice to make. Make Yahweh the king of your life, because you already see right now, just up to this point in the scripture, we're not even all the way to the end yet, because it's going to get so much worse. We're already to this point, and we see the consequences of rejecting God. Why would you want to continue to reject God? You have him at his word here, and we know how things are going to get progressively worse. So please choose Yahweh as your king. So what did we learn today? We learned that Yahweh is king in Israel, right? We see that in those couple of scriptures there, and that he is sovereign through it all. He's the one ordering the events of history. He's using these flawed characters, but through all of it, he's the one in control. Sisera and King Jabin didn't have any sort of influence over these things. They were merely being used by God to demonstrate that he is the one sovereign over the events of Israel at that time. One of the things we also see is that the downward spiral intensifies, and we start to see that Yahweh is sovereign, right? Because we looked at that. Yahweh is the one who did all of these things. It wasn't Barak, it wasn't Deborah, it wasn't Jael. Yahweh is sovereign, and as this downward spiral intensifies, we're going to see that he is, and that people become more and more clueless, right? King Jabin, he's supposed to be this smart, intelligent guy, clueless. Right? Same thing with Sisera. He didn't realize that this housewife was going to kill him. Clueless. By the time we get to Samson, who is a judge, we find that he is clueless. Of course, he does call out on Yahweh a couple times, but it's not in a place of intimacy where he knows God. He's trying to use God to get what he wants. And even the judge, the one that God raises up to deliver, is clueless. But yet Yahweh is still sovereign through it all, and does what he says he's going to do for Israel and deliver them out of the hands of their enemies. So for next time, we're going to be looking at the story of Gideon. So go ahead and read Gideon. That's chapter 6, basically through chapter 8. I think we're going to take a couple of sessions at least to look at Gideon's story since it is the focal point. We want to make sure we hit all of the highlights and stuff that we need with that. But one of the things I want you to sort of think about as you're reading Gideon's story is that Gideon's story is the focal point of Judges. So this is where Yahweh is rejected. So keep that in mind as you're reading it. What really sticks out in the Gideon story, right? What makes this the focal point? Where do you find Yahweh being rejected and Gideon sort of setting himself up as king? Those are, something that you might want to think about. Also, one of Gideon's favorite things or things that he's most known for is the whole using the fleece. But I want to ask you something. Read that part carefully. And we'll kind of get more into it. I don't want to spoil some of it, but ask yourself this question. Does Gideon's use of the fleece show trust in Yahweh or a way to control Yahweh? Think about the context of what Gideon's doing. Think about what he's asking and why he needs to ask a second time. Does Gideon's use of the fleece really show that he trusts Yahweh? Or is he just trying to control him? So think about those things. Read that story. And we'll pick that up in the next one as we sort of reach the focal point and kind of the middle point of this Judges study. And we start to continue to go down the downward spiral because we're not done. We're really just getting started. It's going to get so much worse than this, but we're going to see God is sovereign through it all. So if you're going through the downward spiral in your own life and things are just crazy chaotic, remember, God is sovereign through it all. And he can always pull you out of that downward spiral. You just need to submit to him. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll see you next time.